So, as you heard from Walter and from Ellie, we are in the midst of a sermon series about sin. And I really feel like such a dramatic word should have a dramatic sound effect to follow. But maybe I just feel it in my body that it's dramatic. Several weeks ago, Jen started this series by suggesting that if we are to be a community that works towards reconciliation, both within the world and within ourselves, that we must start at the place of brokenness before we shift into conversations about healing. So using Barbara Brown Taylor's work entitled Speaking of Sin, the Lost Language of Salvation, we began the work by reclaiming a language that many of us have long since put aside. So in the interest of transparency, and before I get going, in the interest of transparency, that I've had a bit of a cold, so I will get a cough drop. But also, since we're talking about sin, I thought I'd confess something to you all. These words, there we go. These words, sin and salvation, they really don't bring up life-affirming and healing images for me. Now, especially as a queer clergy person. I just don't. You know, I'd rather talk about justice and mercy and sassy Syrophoenicians. She is my favorite character in Scripture. If you haven't checked her out, you should. And yet, this is what we're talking about. It may be an uncomfortable journey, one that many of us would rather not go on, so we might have to pull each other back, rein each other back in if we start drifting. The passage that Ellie read today is a perfect place to recap kind of where we are. Abandoning the language of sin will not make it go away. How many of you have tried ignoring things into not existing? How did that work? Oh yeah, okay. It didn't work for me either. For most of us, we've abandoned the language of sin because it has become weaponized. A word used to create categories where not only the behavior is judged, but ultimately the very essence of a person, the original name, beloved, comes into question, which is never in question. Regardless of our choices and our decisions, our core name never changes. It is no wonder that so many of us have chosen to redefine, reimagine, and often altogether abandon this idea of sin. In the word that must not be named place, yeah, I've been listening to a lot of Harry Potter lately, so we have substituted other languages to try and describe our human experience. We have become multilingual, adopting the languages of science, medicine, and law, as well as embracing other languages from other faith traditions and the secular world. And it's good to be multilingual, right? These other languages help us to navigate a diverse and ever-expanding world, and yet Taylor says that if we only adopt these other languages without exploring our own, then we become deficient in our own. We in progressive faith communities have stopped talking about the language of sin and salvation, and thus allowing for a singular interpretation to flood the landscape. Several weeks ago, Jen said, sin is not a moral failure. And so we must be reminded again, because we have so many things to break down, so many barriers to break down, but sin is not a moral failure. The essence of sin is not the violation of laws, but the violation of relationships. And we'll come back to that again, because I think it's helpful to be reminded sin is not a moral failure, but rather a breakdown of relationships. And this could be the relationships with the divine, with others, the relationship I have with myself, the relationship you have with yourself. And so if the breakdown of relationships is the essence of sin, then reconciliation looks a little different than what we've been told. It's not about paying off debts, but about recovering fullness of life. 50 years ago, King spoke of the hope for the beloved community. And today, Barber and Theo Harris and thousands around the country once again speak of the possibilities of what could be. I mean, even this morning we started an altar for the Poor People's Campaign. And the Poor People's Campaign, in this work, these leaders dare to speak hope into the world. And yet hope cannot be uttered without naming first what has been broken. Our biblical narrative starts off with a story that quickly encounters broken relationships. In the beginning, the Creator fashions a garden that's fully stocked and ready for life, and it includes caretakers, Adam and Eve. But despite having all of their material needs met, after conversations with an ingenious slithery agent, Adam and Eve choose to eat from the only tree they were told not to. It is in this moment that this relationship between the divine and the earthly ones fractures. According to Taylor, the story of Adam and Eve is wonderful. Not because there are no problems, because those abound, but because it tells the truth about the way things really are. We really are free to make disastrous decisions. And our choices really do have consequences. And I'm pretty sure anyone who has ever been in the role of parent or guardian knows exactly about the freedom to make disastrous decisions and choices really having consequences. Our choices and these decisions reflect the essential human experience of community and alienation, of connection and disconnection to the divine that were long present before organized faith traditions or preachers or teachers. And the story of Adam and Eve's decision has been used over centuries to talk about sin and original sin. But have you noticed that neither one appear in the story? Sin and original sin do not appear in that creation story, but what is described is a violation of the relationship between God and these earth creatures. Unlike what sin has come to be in our narrower understanding, the Hebrew tradition spoke of disconnection from God in multiple ways, in three in particular. There was chata, avah, and pasha. Chata is used for the sins that missed the mark and where biblical characters have gone astray. I mean, you have to think only of David plotting to kill Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, so that he could marry her. Or avah speaks of the separation from God that includes wrong intent, like the Israelites choosing to worship Baal in the wilderness. Pesha, on the other hand, meaning to rebel, is the full intentional separation from relationship with God. And this can be heard reflected in the prophet Micah's condemnation of wealthy landowners and of unjust laws that punish the poor and women and children. But all three show actions that reflect fractured relationships. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I know me well enough to say that I'm much more comfortable speaking about Pesha. It's easier for me to name the systemic and structural sins that plague our world. Easier for me to cry out like the prophets, naming transgressions I see committed by ignorance, hatred, complicity, and silence. But I know that I have participated in Chata and Ava as well. It's harder to acknowledge and hold myself responsible for my role in fractured relationships. And yet this, too, is part of the critical work that we must take towards healing. Her name was Sarah, and she was 12. And she drove me crazy. I mean, crazy. This was my third year as a camp counselor for the YMCA. And I had learned to handle a lot by then. Day camp will do that to you. But she, in particular, tried my patience like no other. Maybe some of you that are giggling know the same thing. So that day, I was trying to get this group of 11 to 13-year-olds to make a decision on what activity they wanted to do next. And she was causing havoc to my plans with her indecision. I don't want to do that. I don't want to go there. It's hot. Why can't we go inside? I hate coming to this place. Fed up with her whining, I sniped back. Why do you even come then? Why do you just leave? And immediately I saw the pain and the grief and the anger in her eyes. But look, in my defense, how many of you have been to Alabama in the summers? Okay. I don't see any hands. It's hot. It is hot. By 7:30 in the morning, your clothes are sticking to your back with sweat, and it isn't even the heat of the day. And we were short-staffed like usual, and it was the end of the week, and my creative juices on how to entertain more privileged children than I had run out. I was done. And yet, I knew her story. I knew that her parents were going through an extremely ugly and vindictive divorce. I knew that she was forced into the middle and had been made to be the message bearer for both groups. I knew that she hated coming to day camp and that she had no choice whether or not she came. I knew that she and her brother were some of the first dropped off and the last to leave because her parents were still struggling to figure out their new schedule. I knew all of those things, and yet, in my frustration, I reacted in anger. And I caused her harm. And in the moment, I chose to cause harm. You see, the essence of sin is not the violation of laws, but the violation of relationships. Punishment is not paramount. Restoration of relationships is paramount, which means that the focus is not on paying debts, but on recovering fullness of life. Later that day, I went and Begrudgingly, she was willing to talk to me. I wonder. And I apologized. I told her that I knew that she had no choice whether or not she came to camp, and that I was sorry for making a hard experience even harder. See, I owned my own responsibility in causing her harm, and I told myself that I needed to manage my own emotions and my reactions better. And I worked to repair the damage that I had created. And this isn't something that happens once. It's something you keep working at. Keep working to get a little bit more connected, a little bit better at. You see, the prophet Isaiah says in the 58th chapter that you shall be called repairers of the breach. You, individuals and church, shall be called repairers of the breach. But before we can get to the work of repairing, we must first name what is broken, regardless of whether that brokenness comes from our own actions or the embedded messages that we carry around about ourselves. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have done work around the Enneagram. Maybe there's some people in here. It's kind of like a personality grouping of sorts with a lens of spirituality. And instead of numbers, instead of letters, there are numbers. And it says that we each have both a lost childhood message, something that we, regardless of whether or not we were told it, we never took in, and some unconscious message that we embodied. And so for my particular number, the lost childhood message I never received was I am good. And the message that I took in is it's not okay to make mistakes. So other ones that they sound like this. It's not okay to have your own needs. It's not okay to have your own feelings and identity. It's not okay to be too functional or too happy. It's not okay to be comfortable in the world. It's not okay to trust yourself. It's not okay to depend on anyone for anything. It's not okay to be vulnerable or to trust anyone. It's not okay to assert yourself. See, these are the messages that plague our hearts and our minds, and then they become lived out in daily actions. So here too is a place of brokenness. Here too is a place in need of reconciliation. It's not just the stuff that happens in the world, but it's the stuff that happens in our world, the places of brokenness that we have. It is only through first acknowledging what is broken, what breaches exist in our lives, and by choosing to turn around that we are able to begin working towards healing, reconciliation, and repair. So, beloved ones, whose name has never changed, whose name will never change, may we have the courage to name and claim what is ours to do. May we have the courage to name both the sins of the world and to name the ways that we have violated relationships as we do the work of recovering the fullness of life in our world. Amen.